Hi, in today's video we're going to be talking about IRS penalties, specifically how to get rid of them. There are two main ways to get rid of IRS penalties. One is the first time abatement program, and second is the reasonable cause waiver. So let's talk about each of these. Hi, I'm Holland King, a tax attorney that helps small businesses and individuals solve their IRS problems. Whether it's an ongoing audit or past due tax debt, I'm here to help. The IRS has the ability to levy penalties against taxpayers for a variety of reasons, the most common of which is a failure to file or a failure to pay. If you don't file your taxes, you're going to be hit with a penalty. If you don't pay those taxes, then you're also going to be hit with a penalty, which can lead to two different penalties for the same action. There are numerous other penalties, but at the end of the day, penalties can make up a large portion of an amount due by taxpayers. I often see that penalties and interest can make up almost half of the total debt owed by a taxpayer for a given year. If we have a tax liability of $5,000, penalties and interest can add on another $5,000, putting the taxpayer in a position where they have to pay $10,000 to get out from underneath IRS collections. Today's video is not going to go into the intricacies of penalties, how they're calculated, why they're levied, or any of that. But we're going to assume that there has been a penalty assessed on the tax account, and we want to try to figure out a way to reduce those penalties. Now, the IRS has the ability to assess penalties. Oftentimes, those penalties can be discretionary. That's what we'll see in today's video, that the IRS has the ability to waive those penalties and just focus on the taxpayer becoming current with the liability. Now, what I'm leaving out of that equation is interest, because interest is statutorily determined and is going to accrue on the past due amount. On the other hand, if the IRS owes you money, then it also has to pay interest. So it is a little bit of give and take, although that's not great news for those who have past due taxes. So focusing just on the penalties, let's talk about the two main ways that you can get rid of penalties for a given tax debt. First, let's talk about the first time abatement program. This program, much like its name suggests, is available for taxpayers who have otherwise a clean record. If you have been paying your taxes every year, filing on time, making the payments due, haven't had any issues, and for whatever reason you now owe some money and there's a penalty for either failure to file or failure to pay, then it's very likely that you'll be eligible for the first time abatement program. This program, as long as you have made arrangements to otherwise pay off the tax debt, such as an installment agreement, then it's likely that you'll be able to get the penalties for that entire year waived. The good news is that not only does that reduce the total amount that's owed, because you no longer have to pay the penalties, but also it reduces the amount of interest that you're going to have to pay, because interest accrues not only on the underlying tax debt, in our previous example of $5,000, but also on the penalties associated with that tax debt. So if there was $5,000 of liability, $3,000 of penalties, then the interest is accruing both on the $5,000 and on the $3,000. Once you get the penalties waived, then the interest is likewise reduced only to the amount that has been accruing on the underlying tax debt. So instead of interest accruing on all $8,000, now you're only liable for the amount that was accruing on the $5,000 underlying liability. So how do you go about getting a first-time abatement program? You ask. This is one of the easiest programs because it is pretty straightforward. If you call up the IRS, you can find the number on the last tax notice that you received and ask the representative to waive the penalties under the first time abatement program. It's very likely that you'll get that done immediately on the phone. Otherwise, you can send a letter to the IRS. Again, you can find the address on the last notice of your IRS correspondence and request that the penalty be waived under the first time abatement program. Now note, if you owe for several years, then only the first year is going to be eligible, if you're eligible at all. Again, if we have a taxpayer who has been filing and paying on time for several years, and then got into a bad financial situation and stopped paying their taxes for 2018, 2019, and 2020, you're only going to be able to get the first time abatement waiver for 2018. That still leaves you with 2019 and 2020 that you're going to have to deal with. We'll see in a minute another possible way of dealing with it. Now let's take that same taxpayer, but instead of being current up until 2018, this taxpayer started running into trouble in 2015. For 2015, 2016, 17, 18, 19, 20, they had problems paying their taxes. They have managed to get current with 2015, 16, and 17, but still have problems with 2018. In this situation, it's unlikely that they're going to be able to get penalty waiver for 2018 because they already had a history of non-compliance up until that point. They might be able to go back to 2015 and get it, but they won't be able to for 2018. So let's move on to the next way of dealing with penalties. As we noted in the first part, the first time abatement program is only going to be eligible for 1 year, and that's going to be the earliest year in question. That can often be good because the earliest year is also going to be the year that has had the longest time to accrue penalties. And so you're likely to have the largest amount of penalties waived in one fell swoop with the first time abatement program. But that still leaves the other years. And there are situations where the first year is not necessarily the largest year in question. So what other option do you have? Reasonable cause. And this is a little bit more difficult than the first time abatement program. Reasonable cause waiver is very much like its name suggests. You have to have a good reason for not having either filed your taxes or paid your taxes on time. And when I say a good reason, I don't mean, oh, I just didn't feel like it, or I didn't have the money at the time. In its publication, the IRS provides a few possibilities for what would constitute reasonable cause. These include fire, casualty, natural disaster, or other disturbances. So if you were the victim of a natural disaster, such as a hurricane flooding your property, or a fire burning down your house or your business, then that can constitute reasonable cause according to the IRS. The next one is inability to obtain records. If for whatever reason you were working for an employer and they did not give you a W-2, maybe they went out of business or they had their own natural disaster and it prevented them from issuing the W-2, but that might constitute reasonable cause. Now in that instance, you should be able to find other ways of creating those records, such as from your bank statements or from your check stubs, but the inability to obtain records can constitute reasonable cause in some circumstances. The next one is death, serious illness, incapacitation, or unavoidable absence of the taxpayer or a member of the taxpayer's immediate family. Not to make light of a serious situation, but a common trope in family sitcoms is that one of the main characters didn't do their homework because their grandmother passed away. And they eventually get called out asking how many times that grandmother is going to pass away. Likewise, death or serious illness of the taxpayer or somebody in the taxpayer's immediate family. And note, it has to be immediate family, not your third cousin twice removed. Then that might constitute reasonable cause, especially for a non-timely filing. And then the IRS provides a catch-all bucket of other reasons which establish that you used all ordinary business care or prudence to meet your federal tax obligations, nevertheless unable to do so. And this is where we see most reasons that constitute reasonable cause. Here we have kind of a catch-all bucket that you've tried your best but were unable to do so. You still have to make your case, you still have to explain why you were not able to do so, what steps you took in order to do so, and why those were not successful. Some instances I've seen is that you collected all the records, you provided all the records to your accountant, then your accountant issued you a bill or an invoice saying that the work had been completed, and maybe even forged a document saying that they had transmitted it to the IRS. But despite all of that, they had neither prepared the tax return nor transmitted it to the IRS, and you're left with the results. In this case, you tried to do everything that you could. You provided all the records. You trusted a tax professional, and you even checked that the tax professional had transmitted it to the IRS. Unfortunately, they had not done so. In that situation, you might be eligible for a reasonable cause penalty waiver. Now note, this is not nearly as easy as the first time abatement program. as you can see from the examples provided. It's not going to work for every taxpayer, and it's not going to work for every situation. One of the important things to know is that unlike the first-time abatement program, calling up the IRS is probably not the best way of obtaining this. Here, you really do want to sit down, write out your story, and make your case, and get it documented on paper and send it in through the official channels. There is a specific form that you want to fill out. This is going to lay out some of the details that you need to provide, but also it's going to give you the chance to give additional information that you do want to provide. And, if possible, provide documentation to support your story. Now, just because you request it, just because you tell a good story, and just because you document it well, doesn't mean that the IRS is going to approve it. We've talked about in other videos, specifically under the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, that you have the chance to appeal an adverse decision. And if you have a good reason for requesting the penalty abatement, but it's been denied by the IRS, then you should consider appealing it to the IRS Appeals Office. There you will have a better chance of getting it settled, or at least getting some of the penalties waived. If you are appealing an overall adverse decision about the underlying liability, then make sure to consider appealing the penalties as well. Now note, if you have multiple years and you have a reasonable cause for all of those years, the IRS is first going to consider a first-time abatement program for the earliest year, and that's going to take it off the table for later years. They're going to do this because not anything that was required by statute, but because their own internal policies require them to take the easiest route first, which is the first-time abatement program, and then consider other avenues, such as reasonable cause. So make sure that you are considering all of your options when you request a penalty abatement. While both of these options have been around for years, it is still relatively uncommon for taxpayers to request penalty abatement. Again, the first-time program can be fairly easy and just takes a phone call. The reasonable cause, it's going to be a little bit harder and take up more time, but depending on the amount of penalties, it can definitely be worth it. So consider those options the next time that you get hit with penalties by the IRS. If you have any questions regarding this video about penalties, penalty waiver programs, or your situation, either leave a comment below or contact me directly. My information is in the description. If you found this video helpful, hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel. I'll be producing more content like this in the near future. Until then, have a good day.